The stone walls of a medieval town were not only barriers against invaders, but also cages for those who had nowhere to belong. For an orphan, the moment the sun dipped below the horizon and the streets grew colder, survival became a game of silence and shadows. Imagine a child of 7 or 8 years old, barefoot, clutching a ragged cloth that once belonged to a dead parent, trying to curl up in the corner of a marketplace. The cobblestones pressed into their skin like knives, the wind howled through broken shutters, and rats scurried freely, bold enough to nibble at whatever scraps lay nearby. Sleep rarely came easily because the streets were alive with dangers more terrifying than hunger. Imagine being stuck in medieval times with no Wi-Fi, no snacks, and no YouTube. Terrifying, right? Luckily, you don't have to suffer like a lost orphan. Just hit that subscribe button now and your future will look a lot brighter than theirs. Homelessness in the Middle Ages was not just the absence of shelter, it was the constant threat of violence, disease, and despair. In towns, orphans were often pushed to the very edges, to the alleys behind taverns or the graveyards outside city gates. In villages, they hid in barns, competing with animals for warmth. Churches sometimes left their doors unlocked, but even holy places could turn hostile once priests grew tired of beggars cluttering the pews. The children who tried to sneak inside were often chased away, beaten, or told to pray in the freezing night air. For those who dared to stay, the risk of being dragged out by guards or townsfolk was high, and sometimes the punishment was worse than the hunger they were trying to escape. The nights were the cruelest teachers. In the darkness, groups of older beggars or criminals roamed in search of easy prey. Orphans, especially the youngest ones, were easy targets. Their thin frames made them too weak to fight back, and their silence too easy to exploit. Many were robbed of the little they had, a crust of bread, a worn blanket, or even their only piece of clothing, and the punishment for resisting was often a beating that left bones fractured and spirits broken. Some children disappeared entirely, lured by strangers promising food and warmth, only to be sold into servitude or worse. Their names vanished without record, their lives absorbed into the shadows of medieval cruelty. Disease clung to the streets like an invisible predator. With no roof above them, orphans inhaled the stench of sewage and decay every night. Rain turned the ground into a swamp, and winter froze it into an unyielding bed of stone. Pneumonia, fevers, and infections spread quickly, and without care, the body of a child became frail within weeks. Dead orphans were often left in ditches or burned in mass pits, their identities erased, their short existence unnoticed. To the townspeople, their deaths were almost expected, a natural trimming of society's excess. To the surviving orphans, each body was a reminder of how close death walked beside them. What is most unsettling is how the community viewed these children. Instead of compassion, orphans often inspired suspicion and disdain. They were branded as thieves in advance, treated as potential criminals simply because they were poor and parentless. Mothers pulled their children closer when an orphan approached. Shopkeepers raised their voices, and guards were quick to swing their batons. Even those who had nothing themselves found reasons to hate the abandoned children, as if their existence reminded everyone of a fate they were one misfortune away from sharing. The very people who might have offered them bread instead gave them fear and rejection. And yet, within this bleakness, survival demanded creativity. Some orphans learned where the bakers threw their spoiled loaves, or which taverns spilled enough ale to be lapped from the ground. Others discovered that graveyards offered more than silence. They offered earth softened enough to dig into, where the heat of decomposing bodies warmed the soil slightly in the winter. There are chronicles of children who slept near corpses just to steal a little warmth from death itself. The desperation was that raw, that primal, that merciless. But even the smallest acts of survival carried risks. Drinking water from public fountains often meant swallowing parasites, and eating discarded scraps could trigger fatal illnesses. And when one child grew sick, the others around them knew what was coming. The cough that began softly would soon turn violent, the shivers impossible to hide. Within days, the once living body became another nameless figure to be carried away. Those who survived learned to harden their hearts, to stop crying when friends disappeared, because tears made you weaker and weakness was noticed by those who preyed upon you. There were rare instances of kindness, flickers of light in the oppressive dark. A widow might leave bread on her doorstep, pretending it was forgotten there, or a passing monk might slip a coin into a child's palm. But these gestures were exceptions, not rules. Most adults saw helping orphans as a burden or even a sin, fearing that feeding one child would only invite more. Charity was rationed, and even then, it came with strings. To serve, to obey, to give away what little freedom remained. To walk through the streets of a medieval town as an orphan was to carry invisibility and danger in equal measure. People looked past you until they wanted to punish you, and the walls of the city felt like prison bars, keeping you trapped in misery. Every step was a calculation. Where to hide, how to avoid guards, when to beg, and when to run. The choices were never between good and bad, but between dying quickly or slowly. For a child with no family, no roof, and no protection, the streets themselves became both home and predator. The stone arches of the marketplace, the shadows beneath wooden stalls, the rotting hay in a stable, All could mean the difference between life and death for a night. Yet as dawn broke, hunger gnawed deeper and survival meant moving again. The small victories of finding shelter were only temporary because the day demanded something harsher. Finding food, finding work, or stealing enough to survive one more evening. And that struggle was just beginning. By the time an orphan in the Middle Ages reached the age of 6 or 7, the streets had already hardened their bodies and numbed their childhood. Play was a luxury, laughter a memory, and survival demanded labor that few adults today could even imagine enduring. Children who should have been chasing each other in fields were instead carrying buckets of water heavier than their own frames, cleaning the stalls of strangers' animals, or spending hours bent over in fields pulling weeds with tiny bleeding fingers. Work was not optional. It was the only path to see another day. Those who refused or were too weak were beaten, starved, or abandoned once more, as if their existence had to justify itself through toil. The cruel reality was that the medieval economy had an insatiable appetite for cheap hands, and orphaned children fit this role perfectly. A blacksmith could use a boy of 8 to pump the bellows until his arms burned, or a tanner might send a girl to soak hides in urine-filled pits, her skin blistering and reeking for days. In towns, children were hired to run errands, sweeping streets for pennies or carrying baskets of grain up steep alleys. In the countryside, they labored in the fields from dawn until dusk, their backs scorched by the sun and their bellies empty. The line between servant, apprentice, and slave blurred so completely that many orphans never even knew which one they were. All they knew was that their labor was demanded, but never truly rewarded. One of the harshest truths was how early this began. Medieval society had little tolerance for childhood as we know it today. By the age of 5, orphans were expected to work. By 10, they were treated as adults in every way but dignity. Some were apprenticed to artisans, supposedly to learn a trade, but the so-called training was often nothing more than years of unpaid labor. Masters could beat their apprentices at will, starve them for disobedience, or lock them in cellars to break their spirit. For an orphan, there was no parent to complain to, no one to intervene when punishments turned to torture. The master's word was law, and the child's silence was survival. Work was dangerous, and the bodies of orphaned children bore the proof. A fall from scaffolding meant broken bones that never healed properly. A slip near a millstone could mean a crushed hand, ending any chance of labor and therefore life itself. Fires in forges, accidents in stables, and infections from untreated wounds often cut their lives short. Historical records mention lost boys of guilds, children whose names were erased after accidents made them useless. They were discarded, often left to beg or die in the alleys where their lives had begun. Each scar on their skin was not just a mark of injury, but of how society consumed their bodies until nothing was left. The exploitation extended beyond physical labor. Orphans often found themselves trapped in webs of manipulation by merchants who saw in them not only cheap work but disposable tools. A merchant could send a boy into a rival's stall to spy or steal, knowing the punishment would fall solely on the child. Girls were pushed into domestic service, forced to cook, clean, and serve without rest, often enduring harassment or worse at the hands of their employers. Their youth made them vulnerable, their lack of family made them unprotected, and their desperation made them obedient. It was a perfect storm for abuse, and the world rarely looked away in outrage. It simply shrugged and carried on. Even when they managed to secure steady work, food was meager and life was bleak. Payment often came in the form of leftovers, or a corner of a barn to sleep in. A bowl of thin porridge, a crust of stale bread, or the bones stripped of meat by a master's family was considered generous. The lack of nutrition stunted their growth, giving them a frail appearance that made them seem younger than they were. And yet, society expected them to work harder than grown men. Many died in their early teens, their bodies simply unable to sustain the weight of labor and hunger combined. And still, orphans clung to work because the alternative was worse. Begging or stealing was a last resort, as it made them enemies of guards and townspeople alike. Work, however brutal, offered a fragile illusion of belonging, of being part of something larger than themselves. A child with a task, however degrading, could at least hope for a place by the fire, even if it was at the edge of the hearth. That thin hope kept many from collapsing into despair, even as the reality of their situation left them broken in silence. Curiously, there are scattered accounts of orphans who rose slightly above this misery, their endurance turning them into valuable tools for their masters. A blacksmith might eventually grant a skilled boy more trust, letting him shape iron rather than only pump the bellows. A noblewoman might keep a clever girl as a personal servant, sparing her from the filthier tasks. These rare exceptions gave the illusion that hard work could change an orphan's fate. But in truth, they were still bound by servitude, their lives dictated by others. Freedom was never the reward, obedience was. There was also a darker side to this labor system, one that reveals just how much medieval society preyed upon its weakest. Children were sometimes deliberately worked until they collapsed, not out of malice, but out of cold indifference. Their bodies were tools, and tools could be replaced. Orphans were plentiful, their numbers swelling after plagues, wars, and famines. A child who died at the forge today would be replaced by another abandoned soul tomorrow. This endless cycle ensured that the suffering of orphans was not a tragedy to society, but a resource to be exploited. And yet, for the children themselves, work was not just survival, it was identity. With no family name to carry, no inheritance to claim, their only worth was measured in how much labor they could endure. This shaped their sense of self from the very beginning. Imagine a boy who never once hears his own name spoken kindly, only barked as an order. Or a girl who learns to believe her bruises are proof of her usefulness. Childhood in this world was erased by necessity, replaced by a crushing burden of labor that became their only definition. When the sun rose over medieval towns, it marked not the start of freedom, but another day of servitude. The clanging of forges, the creaking of mills, the cries of animals waiting to be tended. These were the lullabies of orphan children forced into roles too heavy for their bodies and too cruel for their years. Their small hands became tools of survival, their backs bent under loads meant for men, their spirits shaped by a world that demanded everything and gave back nothing. And, as the days blurred into years, the struggle for survival was no longer only about finding work, but also about facing the harshest temptations of hunger, where morality and desperation collided in the shadows of the marketplace. Hunger in the medieval world was more than an empty stomach. It was a gnawing force that dictated every thought, every risk, and every betrayal of innocence. For orphans, hunger was the only constant companion, the one presence they could never escape. It hollowed their eyes, shrank their limbs, and drove them into choices that no child should ever face. Bread was more valuable than gold to them, and a single piece of fruit could mean the difference between life and death. Yet, in a world where food was scarce even for families, for those abandoned and nameless, stealing became less a crime than an instinct, as natural as breathing. The marketplace was both a paradise and a trap. Stalls overflowed with bread, meat pies, salted fish, and baskets of apples, but all of it guarded fiercely by merchants who knew too well the tricks of desperate children. An orphan would hover at the edges, pretending to watch the crowd. Waiting for the moment, a merchant turned his head. A quick hand, a slice of bread stuffed under a tunic, and then the pounding heartbeat of flight. But the watchful eyes of guards and apprentices meant danger lurked at every attempt. In some towns, stealing even a handful of grain could mean having an ear cut off or being whipped in public until skin peeled. For a child of 7 or 8, this punishment was not just pain, it was humiliation, a mark that branded them as a criminal forever. Still, hunger was relentless, and fear rarely outweighed desperation. Many worked in groups, distracting sellers while one child darted in for food. Others learned to target the drunk, stumbling out of taverns, snatching purses before vanishing into alleys. Some became experts in running, their thin bodies darting between carts and crowds with the agility of ghosts. There are accounts of guards complaining that chasing orphans was a futile effort because the children knew every hole, every rooftop, every crumbling wall of their towns better than any soldier ever could. For many, that mastery of the streets was the only defense they had against both starvation and punishment. The guards themselves were often more terrifying than hunger. They patrolled with batons and ropes, eager to prove their authority by catching thieves. Orphans caught stealing might be dragged by the hair through the streets, their stolen bread shoved cruelly into the mud as a lesson. Public punishments were meant not just to discipline, but to entertain. Crowds gathered to watch a child whipped, jeered, or locked in wooden stocks, where passers-by could spit on them or throw stones. It was a performance of shame, designed to remind everyone else of what awaited if they dared to steal. And yet, even after such cruelty, many children went back to the marketplace the very next day, because hunger was stronger than fear. Beyond the market, food could be stolen from kitchens or storerooms, but even that required cunning. Some orphans sneaked into monasteries at night, lured by the scent of bread baked for monks. Others raided barns, drinking milk straight from goats or eating raw grain from sacks. But stealing from the church or a noble was even riskier than stealing from merchants. The punishments could be brutal, hands chopped off, branding with hot irons, or imprisonment in dungeons where few survived. And still, the children returned because the choice was simple: steal and risk death, or starve and embrace it willingly. The irony was that society created these thieves by denying them any other way to live. Orphans were condemned as criminals even before they committed crimes, and every act of theft became a self-fulfilling prophecy. Once branded as thieves, no guild would take them, no master would employ them, and no town would welcome them. They became trapped in a cycle where the only way to survive was the very thing that damned them further. Their reputation followed them like a shadow, and so did the suspicion of every adult they encountered. The world made them invisible until they stole, and then punished them for being seen. Curiously, some orphans developed codes among themselves, rules of honor in theft. Older children sometimes shared food with the younger, protecting them from harsher dangers. Others formed small gangs, dividing territories and towns and punishing those who broke the unspoken rules. In this dark underworld of survival, loyalty was currency, and betrayal could mean death. These groups became families of their own making, bonded not by blood but by hunger and necessity. Yet loyalty had limits, because when hunger struck hard enough, even friendships dissolved in the scramble for the last scrap of bread. There are stories of children caught stealing who begged for mercy with heartbreaking honesty. A boy caught with an apple once claimed he only wanted to feed his baby sister, though whether she truly existed or was a desperate lie, no one will ever know. Some guards, hardened though they were, turned their heads at such pleas. Others took cruel pleasure in denying them. The unpredictability of mercy made every theft a gamble, where luck was as important as speed. And for many orphans, luck ran out far too soon. What made the struggle even harsher was that the act of stealing shaped how orphans saw themselves. Guilt was a luxury, one they could not afford, but shame lingered in the quiet moments. Imagine a child of 9 clutching bread stolen from a cart, knowing that the merchant's own children might now go a little hungrier. Survival came at a moral cost, one too heavy for such young shoulders. Over time, that weight numbed them. They stopped asking whether it was right or wrong. They stopped caring who suffered, as long as they could silence the ache in their stomachs for another day. That was the slow erosion of innocence, the way hunger transformed children into shadows of who they might have been. And yet, even stealing was not enough to protect them from exploitation. Merchants and nobles began to see opportunity in this desperation, using orphans not only as laborers, but as tools for their own schemes. They were forced into errands, used to cheat, deceive, or serve in silence, their hunger manipulated until it broke their wills completely. What began as theft for survival often turned into something darker, where children no longer stole for themselves, but for the powerful hands that had trapped them in their web. And in that, another chapter of their suffering unfolded, where hunger gave way to exploitation that reached far beyond the marketplace. Exploitation in the Middle Ages wore many faces, and for orphans, it became almost impossible to distinguish survival from enslavement. Once hunger had broken their pride and desperation had stripped away their choices, they became easy prey for those who held power. Merchants, nobles, and even clergy saw in them a resource more convenient than coin and more expendable than livestock. To take an orphan into one's household was rarely an act of charity. It was a transaction in which the child's labor, obedience, and sometimes even their body were demanded without mercy. Merchants and towns used orphans as invisible workers, cheap enough to risk and disposable enough to replace. Boys were sent through crowded streets carrying goods so heavy that their spines curved before adulthood. They hauled barrels of ale, sacks of grain, and crates of pottery, their small frames staggering under weights that would injure grown men. Payment, if it came at all, was rarely more than a crust of bread or a corner of a stable floor. Girls fared no better, forced into shops to scrub floors, mend clothes, or wash dishes in back rooms where no sunlight reached. They were the hidden machinery that kept markets running, and when their bodies gave out, no one mourned their absence. Nobles, however, practiced exploitation with a cruelty that was wrapped in elegance. In castles, orphans were dressed in rough livery and made to serve at tables they could never eat from. They polished silver they would never hold and fetched wine they would never taste. For the wealthy, these children were not servants but symbols, proof of their authority, living decorations of obedience. Some nobles delighted in humiliating them, forcing them to kneel for hours or carry trays until their arms trembled uncontrollably. For the children, each mistake could mean a strike across the face, a whipping in the courtyard, or nights without food. Fear became their constant companion, teaching them to bow lower, speak less, and move like shadows in corridors lined with tapestries they dared not touch. The darker truth was that exploitation often crossed into abuse. Without family to defend them, orphans were subjected to desires and cruelties they could not escape. Girls were especially vulnerable, used not only as servants, but as objects of predation. Whispers of children being taken into noble chambers or sold into brothels traveled through the towns. Stories spoken in hushed voices, yet accepted as inevitable. The lack of protection made their suffering invisible, their cries swallowed by walls too thick, and communities too indifferent to care. For many, servitude was a slow erosion of dignity, where the line between labor and torment blurred until it vanished completely. The church, too, was not free from this exploitation. While monasteries and convents sometimes took in orphans, it was often less about compassion and more about necessity. Children worked in fields, tended livestock, or copied manuscripts under punishing discipline. Though cloaked in the language of salvation, their reality was one of servitude, disguised as piety. They lived under strict rules, denied freedom of thought or movement, and reminded constantly that obedience was the price of their survival. Some may have found safety within cloisters, but many discovered that the holy walls were only another kind of prison. Exploitation also took the form of binding contracts. Wealthier townspeople sometimes adopted orphans, only to sign them into years of apprenticeship. What appeared on paper as an opportunity to learn a trade often became a life sentence of unpaid work. Masters had the legal right to discipline apprentices harshly, and without family to intervene, abuse was unchecked. These children grew into adults who were broken before they even reached maturity. Their skills learned not through nurturing, but through the lash and the chain. The promise of a craft became a cruel illusion. A carrot dangled before children who would never see it fulfilled. What makes this reality even more haunting is how normalized it was. Medieval society accepted the exploitation of orphans as part of its natural order. A child without family was not seen as someone in need of care, but as property waiting to be claimed. The idea that they might deserve safety or love was rarely entertained. To most, they were simply mouths to be controlled, bodies to be used, and tools to be worn down. Compassion existed in fragments, in the rare kindness of a sympathetic widow or a soft-hearted monk, but these were exceptions against an overwhelming tide of cruelty. And yet, even in this world of exploitation, orphans sometimes clung to small illusions of hope. A boy working in a merchant's shop might dream of one day owning his own stall, though the chance was almost non-existent. A girl serving in a castle kitchen might whisper to herself that one day she would eat at the table rather than carry the plates. These dreams, fragile as they were, kept some alive long enough to endure. But with every passing year, reality chipped away at those illusions until they were replaced by something darker: resentment, bitterness, or the kind of numbness that made survival possible only through surrender. The cycle of exploitation had another cruel twist. It created enemies even among the orphans themselves. Some learned that to gain favor with masters, they had to betray others, informing on thefts or mistakes. This survival strategy bred distrust, turning potential allies into rivals. Exploitation did not just come from the outside. It seeped into the bonds between children, ensuring that unity rarely lasted. Alone and divided, they became easier to control, easier to break, easier to consume. In the end, exploitation was not just about work, nor even about abuse. It was about ownership. Orphans in the medieval world rarely belonged to themselves. They were claimed by the marketplace, by nobles, by the church, by guilds, by anyone with power enough to enforce obedience. Their lives were not their own, their labor not their choice, and their suffering not their secret. And, as their bodies weakened under years of servitude, another enemy awaited, silent and unrelenting: the spread of disease and hunger that would claim countless lives before adulthood ever had a chance to begin. Death lingered over medieval streets like a silent companion, and for orphans, it was never a distant fear but a daily presence. To grow up without parents in that time was to live with the constant awareness that your life might end before it truly began. Disease, hunger, violence, and neglect combined into a cruel lottery where survival was less about strength and more about chance. The fragile bodies of children, already worn thin by labor and malnutrition, became easy targets for illnesses that spread quickly and killed mercilessly. What we might call childhood today was, for them, a race against an early grave. Plagues and fevers were merciless in their hunt for the weak. The smallest cough in winter could spiral into pneumonia, and without warmth or medicine, an orphan's body simply collapsed. Skin infections from cuts, lice infestations, or contaminated water often turned fatal, because even minor wounds became gateways for death. Imagine a boy who sliced his hand while sharpening a tool. The cut swelled, festered, and within weeks the infection spread until his arm blackened. There was no doctor to clean it, no parent to care, no herbs to soothe the pain. His fellow orphans watched helplessly, knowing his body would soon be dumped into a pit with dozens of others, nameless and forgotten. Hunger made their immune systems weaker still. Malnutrition was so severe that many orphans appeared years younger than their true age, their limbs thin and brittle, their teeth rotting from lack of nutrients. Starvation slowed their growth but sped up their deaths. There are reports of children eating grass, clay, or even candle wax just to fill the emptiness in their stomachs. Some resorted to gnawing on animal bones left in trash heaps, trying to suck out the last traces of fat. The act of eating became a desperate fight against death, and often it was a losing battle. When famine swept through villages, orphans were always the first to die, for no one felt bound to protect them. Violence added yet another layer of threat. With no one to defend them, orphans became easy victims for thugs, guards, and even other desperate children. A single fight over food could turn lethal as blows landed on already frail bodies. Nobles sometimes used orphans in bloody entertainments, forcing them to brawl like animals for the amusement of spectators. Others were recruited as squires or pages in times of war, which meant carrying weapons, cleaning armor, and sometimes being thrown into battle long before their bodies or minds were ready. Few survived their first campaign, cut down before their teenage years by swords and arrows that did not care about their youth. Death was not only frequent, it was casual. The bodies of orphaned children were rarely given burials of dignity. In towns, they were piled into mass graves when epidemics raged or burned without ceremony to prevent the spread of disease. In villages, they might be left by the roadside until someone bothered to dig a shallow pit. The lack of ritual or remembrance stripped them of identity, reinforcing the belief that their lives were worth less than others. To survive as an orphan meant to live with the constant knowledge that if you died, no one would remember your name, no one would carve your grave, and no one would pray for your soul. And yet, within this grim cycle, there was one final cruelty: the absolute absence of upward mobility. Medieval society was built like a ladder, but for orphans, the first rung was always broken. No matter how hard they worked, no matter how skilled they became, they were trapped in the lowest class, branded by birth as unworthy of climbing higher. Bloodlines and family names dictated destiny, and orphans had none. A child who showed promise as an apprentice could be cast aside at the whim of a master, his future erased in an instant. A girl who worked tirelessly in a noble's household might never rise above being a servant, no matter her intelligence or loyalty. Opportunity was reserved for those with heritage, leaving the orphan condemned to a lifetime of servitude or poverty. This hopelessness created an invisible prison, perhaps even harsher than hunger or disease, to know that there was no escape, that the world offered no path upward. Crushed spirits before they could bloom, children who dreamed of learning to read, of owning land, of becoming someone respected, quickly realized those dreams were fantasies meant for others. They learned instead to silence their ambitions, to accept that the ceiling above them was fixed and unbreakable. Hope itself became dangerous because it made survival harder when the inevitable disappointments arrived. Occasionally, one or two orphans managed to rise above, becoming priests, soldiers, or craftsmen with enough skill to carve out a slightly better life. These rare exceptions were celebrated in stories, but they were so uncommon that they served more as legends than truths. For everyone who escaped, thousands remained trapped, their lives ending in obscurity. The myth of possibility kept some children striving, but reality always pulled them back down, reminding them that they were marked by their lack of family and condemned by the rigid order of medieval life. The absence of social mobility also ensured that exploitation and death would repeat endlessly. Orphans grew into adults with no wealth, no protection, and no legacy, which meant their own children were likely to suffer the same fate if misfortune struck. The cycle was self-perpetuating, binding generation after generation to the same cruel destiny. Society had no interest in breaking it, because the system benefited from a steady supply of the desperate, the expendable, the voiceless. And so, the wheel of suffering turned without pause. To be an orphan in the Middle Ages was to stand constantly at the edge of life and death, to carry a burden of hunger, exploitation, and despair that most never escaped. It was a life defined not by who you were, but by what you lacked: family, protection, and the smallest chance of rising above. And while the physical pains of disease and hunger carved scars into their bodies, the greater wound was the crushing certainty that they had no place in the world, no path to freedom, and no chance to change the fate that had been written for them before they could even speak their names. In the medieval world, survival for an orphan often came at the cost of identity, dignity, and even humanity itself. The streets, the fields, and the castles had already stolen their childhood, but the deeper tragedy was how society shaped them into something less than people. They were seen not as children to be nurtured, but as tools, burdens, or shadows drifting on the edges of order. To live without parents meant to live without protection, and to live without protection meant to constantly fight for the right to exist. The culmination of hunger, disease, exploitation, and despair built into a fate that was almost inevitable: early death, anonymity, and silence. Yet it was in that silence that the harshest truths of their lives were written. One of the cruelest aspects was how orphans were stripped of names and legacies. A child without family could not inherit land, property, or even the recognition of bloodline, which meant they were erased from the very structures that held medieval society together. A surname in those times was more than just identification. It was proof of belonging, a key that opened doors into trades, guilds, or even marriage alliances. Without it, orphans were outsiders forever. Their names were often replaced by nicknames tied to their flaws or circumstances. The lame one, the bastard, the mute, or simply the boy from the alley. This reduction to labels carved into them a sense of worthlessness, an idea that they were not people in the same way others were. And in a society that worshipped lineage, being nameless was a death sentence long before the grave arrived. This absence of recognition fed into their invisibility. The medieval world was filled with rituals of belonging: baptisms, feasts, festivals, guild gatherings, and marriages. Orphans were excluded from nearly all of them. They stood at the edges of crowds, watching others celebrate, while knowing that they themselves would never be invited. A child without family was a child without witnesses to their life. No one to clap when they succeeded, no one to comfort when they failed, no one to mourn when they were gone. Their stories died as quickly as they lived, and the world carried on as though they had never existed. This invisibility was its own form of violence, a reminder that the greatest cruelty was not the whip or the hunger, but being forgotten while still alive. The lack of upward mobility compounded this despair. Orphans had no chance to rise through social ranks, no path to wealth or power. Medieval life was structured like stone walls, rigid, immovable, and unforgiving. A noble remained noble by birth, a peasant remained peasant, and an orphan remained beneath even that. Ambition for them was not only futile but dangerous, because society punished those who dared to reach higher than their station. If an orphan displayed talent, say a boy with an unusual gift for writing or a girl with skill in healing herbs, the best they could hope for was to be used by others. Their talents rarely became their salvation. Instead, they became chains that tied them to masters who benefited from their abilities while denying them recognition. Even brilliance was stolen from them, leaving nothing that could elevate their fate. Religion offered both hope and betrayal. The church preached compassion and charity, yet in practice it often treated orphans as expendable labor. Some were brought into convents or monasteries, where they copied manuscripts or worked in fields under strict discipline. While these places sometimes shielded them from the cold, they also demanded total obedience, and any trace of individuality was erased in the process. The promise of salvation was dangled before them, but the daily reality was another form of servitude. The irony was bitter. The very institution that preached that all souls were equal in the eyes of God treated parentless children as lesser, even in the pursuit of holiness. For those who remained on the streets, violence was inescapable. Older beggars, desperate criminals, and even drunken townsfolk used orphans as scapegoats for crimes or beat them for sport. Children became pawns in feuds, blamed for thefts they did not commit, dragged into punishments designed for adults. There are accounts of children being publicly executed for stealing bread or for simply being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Their deaths were not tragedies to the crowd, but lessons to the living. Society used their suffering to reinforce its rules. Each orphan's body became a spectacle, a warning that order would be maintained at any cost. And yet, even within this despair, there were flickers of resistance. Some orphans refused to submit, carving out their own codes of survival. They formed secret alliances, hiding places, and systems of trade among themselves. A boy might steal bread, but leave part of it hidden under a stone for another child to find. A girl might learn to read stolen scraps of parchment and then whisper the words to her companions, keeping alive a fragment of knowledge denied to them. These acts of solidarity were fragile, but they revealed something deeper. Even in the harshest conditions, humanity fought to endure. It was not always enough to change their fate, but it was enough to remind them that they were still alive. The final destination for most was death before adulthood. Few orphans survived beyond their 20s, and many did not reach their teens. Their deaths were swift, their lives cut short not by one cause, but by 1,000 small cruelties. A fever untreated, a winter night too cold, a master's punishment too severe, a hunger too deep to overcome. And when they were gone, their absence made no ripple in the world. The carts carried them to pits, the soil covered them, and their memory dissolved. This inevitability was perhaps the greatest cruelty of all. Not only that they died, but that their deaths confirmed what society had believed all along, that they were expendable, replaceable, forgotten. Yet, as haunting as their fate was, the story of orphans in the Middle Ages is also a mirror of the world that created them. Their suffering reflected the rigidity of social order, the hypocrisy of religion, the greed of the powerful, and the indifference of the masses. They were not born cursed, but were made so by the very structures that claim to uphold civilization. To remember their stories is to peel back the polished surface of medieval life and confront the darkness that lived beneath. And it leaves us with an uncomfortable truth. For every child who perished, nameless and unseen, there was a society that chose silence over compassion and order over mercy. That silence is what echoes most, even centuries later. The story of orphans in the Middle Ages was not just one of hunger, cold, and punishment. It was also a story of fear that seeped into every moment of their existence. Fear was a constant shadow, more faithful than friends, more reliable than kindness. It was there when they awoke on the hard stones of the marketplace, when they entered the kitchens of nobles, when they stole bread under the eyes of guards. This fear was not irrational. It was carefully cultivated by a world that reminded them daily that they were unwanted, unprotected, and easily erased. One of the most immediate fears was of violence, both from strangers and from those who claimed to be their protectors. In towns, drunken men roaming after taverns closed often sought out orphan children as easy victims. A boy wandering alone could be dragged into an alley, beaten for sport, or pressed into servitude by brute force. Girls faced even darker dangers, often pursued or cornered by men who saw their vulnerability as permission. The silence of night did not bring rest. It brought terror, where every sound of footsteps could mean danger. For a child with no family, no locked doors, and no one to intervene, the world outside was an endless gauntlet of threats. But fear also lived inside the walls of castles and homes. Nobles who employed orphans as servants often ruled them with fists and whips. A mistake as small as dropping a jug of wine or failing to bow deeply enough could mean a beating that left scars for life. Some lords and ladies took perverse pleasure in inventing punishments, forcing children to kneel on stones for hours or to hold burning candles until their skin blistered. For girls, service in noble houses came with the unspoken danger of being forced into chambers where their innocence was stolen under threat of death. These abuses were whispered about in towns, but rarely condemned, because the victims had no family to defend them and no voice that society would heed. Even the church, which should have been a place of refuge, often fueled this climate of fear. Monasteries and convents demanded strict obedience, and disobedience was punished swiftly. Orphans, taken in by religious institutions, lived under the constant threat of lashings, fasting, or isolation cells for even the smallest acts of defiance. Worse still, some clergy abused the trust placed in them, taking advantage of the children in ways that could never be spoken aloud. Cloisters that should have offered safety instead became silent prisons, where faith was twisted into another chain binding children to fear. This fear was not only physical, but also psychological. Orphans grew up knowing they were watched, judged, and distrusted. People believed that parentless children were cursed, marked by God's displeasure, or destined for crime. Mothers warned their children not to play with them, and townsfolk accused them of misfortune whenever crops failed or livestock died. Superstition painted them as ill omens, and some were even accused of witchcraft when strange events occurred. Imagine a 9-year-old girl blamed for a village fire simply because she had no family to defend her. Fear became a self-fulfilling prophecy. Society feared the orphans, and the orphans lived in fear of society's judgment. But the most haunting fear of all was the fear of invisibility, the fear of vanishing without anyone noticing. For an orphan, death was not only likely, it was certain. And what terrified them most was not the act of dying, but the certainty that no one would remember. To know that your body might be left in a ditch, unburied, unblessed, was a fear so deep that it shaped their very sense of self. This awareness aged them long before their time. Children who should have feared monsters and stories instead feared becoming the forgotten dust beneath society's boots. The psychological toll of this constant fear twisted their identities. Some became hypervigilant, learning to read every expression, every gesture, every change in tone of voice, as if their survival depended on predicting danger before it struck. Others withdrew completely, turning silent, avoiding eye contact, erasing themselves to escape notice. These survival strategies, though effective in the short term, left deep scars. They grew into adults who did not know trust, who could not form bonds, and who lived with the restless expectation that cruelty was always near. Their lives were not just shortened by hunger and disease, but by the weight of fear that eroded their spirits from within. Curiously, history records occasional instances where this fear transformed into something resembling defiance. Some orphans, pushed beyond endurance, lashed out against their abusers. They ran away from masters, burned barns in retaliation, or stole not for survival, but for revenge. These acts were rare and often ended in brutal punishments, but they revealed a spark that fear could not fully extinguish. In some ways, fear became both their captor and their weapon. It taught them cunning, stealth, and the ability to survive in shadows, skills that sometimes allowed a few to escape their oppressors, at least for a while. Still, for the vast majority, fear was a cage that only tightened with age. It kept them obedient to masters, silent before priests, and cautious before townsfolk. It robbed them not only of safety, but of imagination, crushing dreams before they could take shape. To live in constant fear was to live half dead, waiting for the final blow that would erase them completely. And as this fear hollowed out their days, it led to the most inevitable conclusion of all, that even those who survived the beatings, the hunger, and the punishments would rarely live long enough to escape the grip of disease and despair that stalked every medieval street. To be an orphan in the Middle Ages was to live inside a prison without walls, condemned not by crime but by circumstance. Survival demanded everything, but the world gave nothing back. By the time they reached adolescence, if they even lived that long, the weight of suffering had already sculpted their futures. What remained was not the innocence of youth, but a body and mind weathered by years of hunger, labor, and fear. Childhood was erased, adulthood was thrust upon them, and even then, the promise of a better tomorrow was a lie whispered by a society that had already decided their fate. Disease was the most relentless executioner, stalking children in alleyways, barns, and even within monasteries. Epidemics, such as the plague or outbreaks of smallpox, swept through towns like fire, consuming the weakest first. Orphans, already malnourished and exposed to the filth of the streets, rarely stood a chance. Their bodies became the first to collapse, their fevers the first to rage. Accounts from chroniclers describe streets littered with corpses of abandoned children, their lifeless bodies carried off in carts to mass graves dug hastily outside the city walls. There was no mourning, no candles lit, no names carved into stone. The absence of ceremony stripped away what little humanity they had left, leaving behind only silence where there should have been grief. Hunger, however, was the constant tormentor, and it aged children long before disease could claim them. The hollow cheeks, the sunken eyes, the brittle bones, these were not just the marks of famine, but the very identity of the medieval orphan. Malnutrition warped their growth, leaving them frail and stunted, often mistaken for much younger than their true years. In their desperation, many turned to eating things never meant for human mouths. Weeds plucked from ditches, spoiled grains scavenged from animal troughs. or rats roasted over feeble fires. In some cases, starvation forced them into darker acts, whispered about but rarely written down, rumors of children eating bark, leather, or even flesh during the harshest winters. These stories, though shrouded in horror, remind us just how desperate their struggle had become when the line between survival and humanity blurred into shadow. And yet, even those who endured the cold and hunger rarely escaped the crushing weight of hopelessness. The rigid structure of medieval society left them trapped in an endless cycle. To be born without family was to be born without future. Guilds rejected them, noble households exploited them, and villages distrusted them. With no land, no dowry, and no lineage, marriage was often impossible. Those who lived into adulthood often found themselves repeating the same existence as beggars or laborers, their suffering merely stretching into longer years rather than ending in childhood. The medieval ladder of class was carved in stone, and orphans were not even placed at the bottom. They were pressed beneath it, invisible and voiceless. There was, however, a cruel irony in their existence. The world that despised them also relied on them. Wars needed squires and pages, nobles needed servants, merchants needed cheap hands to carry loads. The church needed laborers for its fields and kitchens. Orphans filled all these roles, keeping society's wheels turning while being denied recognition as part of it. They were the unseen scaffolding of medieval life, a hidden workforce of children whose contribution was erased even as it was essential. This paradox fueled bitterness, a quiet resentment that sometimes exploded in acts of rebellion or violence, small flames of defiance quickly stamped out by the iron hand of authority. Yet among all the cruelty, what lingers most is the suffocating inevitability of their destiny. For an orphan, death was rarely a surprise, it was the expectation. Many grew up knowing they would not see adulthood, and this awareness haunted them in every choice. Imagine a child of 10 years old sitting by a wall at night, whispering to himself that he might not live to see another winter. Such thoughts did not come from imagination, but from the harsh arithmetic of their reality, where every sickness, every beating, every hungry day was another step closer to the grave. Hope itself became dangerous because it only deepened the pain when reality struck it down. The final cruelty was the way their stories ended, not with resolution, not with redemption, but with silence. Their deaths went unmarked, their lives unrecorded. History remembers kings, knights, and merchants, but it has little to say about the thousands of children who lived and died unseen. The rare exceptions, orphans who rose to become monks, soldiers, or craftsmen, stand out not because they were common, but because they were extraordinary. Miracles that defied a system designed to crush them. For the overwhelming majority, their existence dissolved into anonymity, their names lost, their suffering erased, their humanity denied. And yet, when we piece together these fragments of their lives, a larger truth emerges. The orphans of the Middle Ages were not simply victims of misfortune. They were reflections of a society built on hierarchy, cruelty, and indifference. Their suffering was not accidental. It was engineered by a system that saw them as expendable. They remind us that civilization has always had its shadows, its forgotten voices, its silenced children. To tell their story now is to give them back, in some small way, the dignity they were denied in life. But even as we close our eyes on their world of suffering, the image that lingers is not only of their pain, but of their endurance. Fragile, nameless, and despised, they survived longer than they should have, clinging to life with a strength that defied their broken bodies. And it is in that endurance, raw, desperate, uncelebrated, that we see the clearest reflection of the medieval orphan's truth. For though the world denied them freedom and society denied them hope, their very survival, however brief, was its own act of defiance against a fate that had been written long before they took their first breath. In the brutal landscape of medieval life, there was one place where many believed an orphan might find safety: the church. Monasteries, convents, and parish houses presented themselves as sanctuaries, places where the poor and abandoned could seek shelter under the wings of God. And for some children, the sight of a monastery's stone walls or a convent's iron gate was the closest thing to hope they had ever seen. But the reality inside those walls was far more complicated. To be taken in by the church was not always a blessing. It was often the beginning of another kind of servitude, cloaked in the language of salvation, but built on the same foundations of obedience and labor. For the fortunate few, being accepted by monks or nuns meant they would not freeze on the streets or starve in the alleys. A bed, however thin, was better than the bare ground, and a bowl of porridge was more than what the marketplace offered. These small mercies could feel like miracles to a child who had known nothing but hunger and exposure. Some monasteries even treated orphans as potential novices, teaching them to read and write, skills almost unheard of for the lower classes. A boy who copied manuscripts in a scriptorium, or a girl who learned prayers by heart, could glimpse a world of knowledge and order beyond the chaos of the streets. These cases fed the myth that the church was a refuge of compassion. But beneath this image of holiness lay a harsher truth. The church was also one of the largest landowners and institutions of power in the medieval world, and with power came exploitation. Orphans who entered monasteries were often assigned to the hardest work, tilling fields from sunrise to sunset, hauling water, grinding grain, tending livestock, or scrubbing endless floors. They worked not only for survival, but to sustain the wealth and influence of the very institution that had taken them in. The prayers they recited each morning were accompanied by blisters, calluses, and exhaustion, proof that salvation was always tied to labor. Discipline inside these holy walls was unforgiving. Silence was enforced with severity, and even minor disobedience could lead to punishment. Children who fidgeted during prayers were beaten with rods. Those who failed to memorize verses were sent to fast for days. Punishments were not viewed as cruelty, but as correction, as though suffering itself was a tool of God. For a child who had come to the church seeking compassion, this rigid discipline often felt indistinguishable from the punishments of nobles or merchants. The difference was only in the language used. The blows were the same, but they were justified as divine. There were darker shadows as well, ones rarely spoken aloud. History records whispers of abuse, particularly when children were placed under the authority of powerful monks or priests who faced little scrutiny. With no parents to defend them and no witnesses to believe them, orphans became vulnerable to violations that could never be named, much less punished. These stories often remained hidden, locked behind the walls of monasteries, but they formed part of the unspoken fear carried by many who entered those institutions. The church promised safety, but for some, it became another prison where innocence was stolen in silence. Still, the spiritual atmosphere offered something unique, a sense of belonging that the streets could never provide. Orphans who lived under the care of monks or nuns were given a new identity, not as beggars or thieves, but as children of God. They wore simple robes, chanted in unison, and shared rituals that gave them a place within a larger story. For children who had been invisible their entire lives, this feeling of being part of something greater carried weight. Even when the daily reality was labor and obedience, the illusion of belonging could soothe the ache of abandonment. And yet, this belonging came at the price of freedom. Once taken in, many orphans never left. The church had little interest in raising children, only to release them back into poverty. Instead, they were kept as lifelong servants, their lives shaped entirely by the needs of the institution. A boy who began as a farmhand might end as a monk, not because he chose the path, but because no other path was open to him. A girl who worked in a convent's kitchens might take vows not out of faith, but because it was the only way to secure food and shelter. Their destinies were less about divine calling and more about the practical reality of survival. There were occasional exceptions, rare stories of orphans who rose within the church to positions of influence. A gifted child might become a scribe of renown, his manuscripts valued across kingdoms. Another might grow into a priest, preaching sermons that carried the weight of experience born from suffering. But these cases were as unusual as a spark in the dark, more legend than reality. For most, the church was not a ladder of opportunity, but a ceiling that pressed them down, ensuring their lives remained in service to others. The paradox of the church's role in the lives of orphans is striking. It was both a sanctuary and a system of control, a place where children were rescued from the streets only to be bound by chains of duty. Some found comfort in its rituals, others despair in its walls. What unites their stories is the constant truth that even within the shadow of holiness, orphans were rarely free from suffering. The hope of protection could turn swiftly into the reality of exploitation, and the dream of belonging could dissolve into the certainty of servitude. And as orphans grew within those cloisters, they learned that their survival was not the end of their struggle. For outside the walls of monasteries and convents, the world still judged them as nameless, cursed, and expendable. To leave the safety of the church was to risk once again the cruelty of the streets, the hunger of famine, and the disdain of society. Their lives remained trapped between two prisons, one of stone and one of silence. And beyond both lay the final, inescapable truth that even when sheltered by God's house, they were never free from the fate that medieval society had written for them from the very moment they lost their parents. The emergence of orphanages in the Middle Ages seemed at first glance like a beacon of hope in a world that had so little mercy to spare. Towns and cities, burdened by the growing numbers of abandoned children, began to establish crude institutions meant to gather them under one roof. These early orphanages were not born out of love or compassion, but rather out of necessity. Too many children roaming the streets created unrest, drew complaints from merchants, and disrupted the image of order that the church and nobility tried to project. To confine orphans into controlled spaces was as much about maintaining social stability as it was about saving young lives. The conditions within these places, however, were far from the sanctuary people might imagine. Buildings were overcrowded, dark, and unsanitary. Dozens of children shared single rooms, sleeping on straw mats alive with vermin, their bodies pressed so close together that disease spread like wildfire. Orphanages quickly became breeding grounds for sickness, where coughs turned into epidemics and fevers swept through entire halls. Mortality rates were staggering. Records from some institutions suggest that more than half of the children taken in never survived their first year. What was meant to shield them from death often delivered it more swiftly. Food was scarce, and what little there was rarely nourished growing bodies. Gruel made of barley or oats, sometimes flavored with a hint of onion or garlic, was the daily meal, and even that was rationed. Bread was stale, milk was watered down, and meat was almost never offered. Malnutrition stunted their growth, leaving children thin, frail, and permanently weakened. Many bore the marks of rickets, crooked spines, or swollen bellies caused by deficiency. The cruelty of starvation was not only in the constant ache in their stomachs, but in the way it left their bodies unable to fight the very diseases that ran rampant around them. Beyond hunger and illness lay another harsh truth. Orphanages functioned less as havens and more as labor camps. From the moment a child could walk steadily or hold a tool, they were put to work. The younger ones cleaned, carried water, or spun wool, while the older ones were sent into workshops or fields. The institution profited from their labor, justifying it as discipline and training for adulthood. Obedience was drilled into them through strict routines, prayers at dawn, endless chores, and punishments for any sign of resistance. Childhood was not preserved in these places. It was systematically erased under the weight of duty. The caretakers themselves were often stern figures, sometimes clergy, sometimes widows or poor women employed by the town. Few were motivated by kindness. Many saw the children as burdens, mouths to feed that drained resources, and thus treated them with cold indifference. Beatings were common, justified as necessary to correct wayward spirits. The sound of crying children was not unusual, and silence was demanded as proof of good behavior. Even when abuse was not physical, it was emotional, the constant reminder that these children were unwanted charity cases, and that their very existence depended on obedience. Still, within the bleakness, faint traces of humanity emerged. Some orphanages kept records of the children's names, baptisms, and small details of their lives. Though most of these documents are long lost, the few that survive reveal desperate notes written by parents who abandoned their children out of starvation, begging the institution to protect them. There are also accounts of rare caretakers who showed genuine affection, slipping extra bread to the weakest, teaching a child to read, or comforting them during illness. These sparks of compassion were not enough to erase the systemic cruelty, but they offered small glimmers of light in an otherwise suffocating world. The role of the church was especially significant in shaping these institutions. Orphanages often stood adjacent to convents or monasteries, run under strict religious codes. The children were raised in faith, learning prayers before they learned words, singing hymns instead of songs, and attending Mass daily. Religion was their anchor, but also their chain. It gave them identity as children of God, yet kept them bound in obedience, with little space for individuality or freedom. For some, this brought comfort. For others, it became another reminder that their lives were not their own. Perhaps the greatest tragedy of orphanages was that they were not stepping stones to better lives. Most children who survived did not leave with education, wealth, or opportunity. Instead, they were funneled into the same servitude they might have faced on the streets: apprenticeships in workshops, positions as domestic servants, or labor in fields owned by the nobility or the church. Girls were sometimes married off young, not for love, but as practical arrangements, while boys were sent into armies or guilds where they remained at the mercy of masters. The institution gave them life, but rarely gave them freedom. It is easy to look back on these places and imagine they were cruel by design, but in truth they reflected the broader society that built them. The medieval world had no concept of childhood as a protected stage of life. Children were seen as small adults, meant to work, obey, and endure. Orphanages merely extended this belief, applying it with particular severity to those who had no families to defend them. The result was a system where orphans were gathered, controlled, and used, not cherished or raised in love. And yet, the very existence of these institutions hints at an uneasy truth. Medieval society, however flawed, recognized the problem of abandoned children. They could have been left entirely to die on the streets, and many were. But the creation of orphanages, however harsh, shows that society could not completely ignore the suffering. In a way, these institutions were a compromise between cruelty and compassion, a reflection of a world torn between indifference and duty. But as we consider their reality, we see that orphanages were never true sanctuaries. They were cages where life was preserved only enough to keep it useful, where suffering was structured instead of chaotic. For the children within, the walls may have kept out the cold, but they also kept in despair. And once those gates closed, the possibility of freedom faded, leaving behind a generation whose lives were dictated not by choice, but by the institutions that claimed to save them. Being taken in as an apprentice was often presented as a blessing for orphans in the Middle Ages. To the outside world, apprenticeship looks like a chance for salvation, a way for a child with no family name to carve out a place in society. A master promised to teach them a trade, feed them, clothe them, and give them a roof. For townspeople and clergy, the system seemed like an act of mercy, a bridge from destitution to stability. But the reality for the children themselves was far more brutal. Apprenticeship was rarely a path to freedom. It was another form of bondage disguised as opportunity, and for an orphan, it often became a life sentence of servitude. The contract of apprenticeship was binding and absolute. Once a child entered it, there was no turning back. Orphans had no parents to negotiate terms, no one to protect their rights, no one to ensure they were treated fairly. A boy might be apprenticed to a blacksmith, expected to learn the art of shaping iron. A girl might be given to a weaver, trained to spin and dye fabrics. But the reality was not education, it was labor. They fetched water, carried wood, cleaned tools, and endured endless hours of backbreaking work. The training often came only after years of drudgery, and even then, many were never taught the full craft. Masters feared giving too much knowledge to those they considered expendable, keeping true skill for their own sons or blood relatives. Punishment was constant and unquestionable. Apprentices were beaten for laziness, whipped for mistakes, and locked away for disobedience. A missed curfew could mean being denied food for days, while a broken tool might lead to scars that lasted a lifetime. Masters wielded absolute power, and without parents to intervene, apprentices had no defense. Some were even branded with hot irons or forced to wear shameful signs for minor errors. The law protected the authority of the master far more than the well-being of the child. Orphans quickly learned that silence and obedience were not just virtues, but tools of survival. The living conditions of apprenticeships were harsh. Children slept in crowded lofts or in corners of workshops, surrounded by the stench of smoke, animals, and sweat. They woke before dawn and worked until long after dusk. Food was meager, often no better than what they might have scavenged on the streets. Stale bread, thin broth, scraps of meat when the master's family was feeling generous. Clothing was little more than rags, patched repeatedly until fabric fell apart. And yet, these hardships were cloaked under the illusion of stability. The streets may have offered death in days, but apprenticeship offered death in years, a slower erosion of body and spirit under the weight of labor. Even when apprenticeships fulfilled their supposed purpose, the outcome was bleak. After years of service, an orphan might finally be considered trained, but they had no money to open a shop of their own, no land to settle, no network of relatives to support them. Guilds, which controlled trades in towns, often refused to accept orphans as full members, citing their lack of heritage. A boy could spend a decade under a master only to be cast back into poverty, his labor consumed without reward. For girls, the situation was even worse. Most were kept in domestic service until marriage age, then discarded without dowries, leaving them vulnerable to exploitation once again. Apprenticeships were also ripe for deception. Some masters purchased orphans under the guise of teaching them skills, only to use them as servants for life. Others broke contracts without consequence, abandoning children once they became sick, injured, or too weak to work. Historical records tell of apprentices thrown onto the streets with nothing after years of labor, their futures destroyed before they even began. The promise of a craft was a carrot that dangled forever out of reach, keeping children obedient but never truly rewarded. What made the system especially cruel was how it disguised exploitation as opportunity. Townsfolk praised masters for taking in orphans, considering it charity while ignoring the abuse that followed. The children themselves sometimes clung to the illusion, convincing themselves that enduring pain today might lead to freedom tomorrow. This hope kept them going, but it was a hope built on lies. Rarely did apprentices rise to independence. More often, they became trapped in cycles of service that ended in obscurity. Yet even within this bleak system, there were faint stories of resilience. Some apprentices absorbed scraps of knowledge in secret, practicing skills late at night when masters were asleep. A boy might steal bits of iron to practice forging in hidden corners, or a girl might memorize patterns of weaving with stolen threads. A handful of these children managed to one day escape and survive independently, though their numbers were small. These rare cases became whispered legends among orphans, proof that endurance and cunning might yield escape, though the odds were mercilessly stacked against them. The cruelty of apprenticeship was not just in its conditions, but in its betrayal of what it promised. It offered the illusion of a path forward, yet delivered only another chain. For an orphan, the choice was no choice at all: starve in the streets or surrender to a master who might work them to death. And as their hands calloused, their backs bent, and their spirits withered, they began to realize that the world did not intend for them to rise, but to serve until they broke. And so, apprenticeships became yet another chapter in the cycle of control, binding children in contracts that masqueraded as mercy. Their labor built the crafts and trades of medieval towns, but their names disappeared from the records, leaving behind only the products of their toil. And when the final years of service ended, those who survived were left staring at a society that still denied them belonging, forcing them once again to find survival in the cracks of a world that never wanted them to stand tall. The life of a medieval orphan was already steeped in hunger, servitude, and punishment, but perhaps the most corrosive wound they endured was social rejection. If labor broke their bodies, marginalization broke their spirit. In a society obsessed with family names, bloodlines, and honor, a child without parents was seen not simply as poor, but as defective, marked, cursed, or unworthy of trust. To be an orphan was to wear an invisible brand, one that made every door harder to open, every hand less likely to reach out. And while physical suffering might be endured, the slow poison of exclusion left scars that no bread or shelter could heal. Suspicion surrounded them from the moment they were old enough to be noticed. Townsfolk whispered that orphans were thieves in waiting, born to criminality by virtue of their parentless state. A boy with no surname was seen as dangerous, a girl with no family as dishonorable. Even if they had done nothing, their reputation preceded them like a curse. Children of merchants were forbidden from playing with them, while priests warned that orphans were wild and needed discipline. In this way, society turned them into outcasts before they ever had the chance to prove themselves. The very act of surviving without parents was twisted into proof of guilt. This stigma followed them everywhere. Begging on the streets was met not with pity, but with contempt. A starving orphan who stretched out a hand for bread was often beaten away with sticks or mocked for being lazy. Even the poor, who had little themselves, sometimes turned against orphans, perhaps because their presence was a constant reminder of the fragility of family and the nearness of tragedy. To help one was to admit that misfortune could come for anyone, and so many chose instead to deny their humanity altogether. The result was a crushing loneliness, a constant message that they were unwanted in every space they entered. Religion, which should have softened this rejection, often sharpened it. Orphans were sometimes labeled as living symbols of sin, their parentless state interpreted as punishment for the misdeeds of their families. In sermons, they were warned against as examples of God's wrath, children who existed to remind others of the wages of sin. This stigma made it almost impossible for orphans to integrate into communities of faith, where belonging required lineage and recognition. Even when they prayed alone, their voices echoing in churches that saw them as burdens rather than believers. The very institution that should have sheltered them often reinforced their exclusion. Girls bore an even heavier weight of this marginalization. Without dowries or family honor, they were considered unmarriageable, destined to remain servants or to fall into prostitution. Many were shunned by women in villages who saw them as rivals or temptresses, potential threats to the fragile bonds of family. The mere presence of an orphan girl near a household could spark suspicion, as if her lack of roots made her inherently dangerous. This distrust forced many into darker paths of survival, where they became trapped in cycles of exploitation that only deepened their exclusion. For them, rejection was not just a social wound, but a fate that shaped every step of their future. The language used against orphans revealed the depth of society's disdain. They were called bastards, strays, cursed ones, words that stripped them of individuality and turned them into symbols of shame. In some towns, laws were written specifically to control orphans, restricting their movements or punishing them more harshly for crimes. The marginalization was not just cultural, it was institutional, baked into the very structures of medieval governance. Orphans were not allowed to join many guilds, denied entry into schools, and excluded from communal decision-making. They were outsiders by law as well as by prejudice, cementing their role at the very bottom of society. Yet, in the midst of rejection, orphans developed unique forms of identity. They became wanderers, storytellers, or petty thieves, roles that gave them at least some recognition, even if it was negative. A boy who sang in taverns for coins, a girl who told fortunes in the market, these were ways of carving out a space in a world that had no space for them. Some embraced the reputation society had forced upon them, becoming the very thieves or tricksters they were accused of being. Others turned inward, surviving quietly, blending into the shadows until they were almost invisible. In both cases, marginalization shaped not only how society saw them, but how they saw themselves. What made this rejection so devastating was that it denied orphans the one thing that could have saved them: community. Medieval life was built on networks of kinship, guild membership, and shared identity. To be excluded from these networks was to be condemned to permanent isolation. Even when orphans managed to secure work or shelter, they remained outsiders, never fully trusted, never fully accepted. This lack of belonging weighed on them more heavily than hunger, because hunger could be temporarily fed, but loneliness hollowed them out from within. Occasionally, a rare orphan broke through this wall of rejection. Some found patrons willing to champion them, priests who saw them as souls rather than burdens, or nobles who favored them for their obedience. These cases, however, were exceptions that proved the rule. For the vast majority, the path was closed, the doors locked, the community unwilling to see them as equals. Their lives became cycles of effort followed by rejection, resilience followed by exclusion. And over time, many stopped trying, their spirits beaten down by the relentless message that they did not belong. The marginalization of medieval orphans reveals not just their suffering, but the cruelty of the society around them. It was not enough that they lacked food or family. They were denied even the dignity of acceptance. Their exile was not physical, but spiritual, a permanent state of being outsiders in a world obsessed with belonging. And this rejection was not just a burden of childhood. It followed them into adulthood, shaping their futures and trapping them in cycles of poverty and exclusion. And as they grew older, they learned that rejection was not their final obstacle, but the prelude to an even harsher destiny, where war itself would claim them as pawns in battles they never chose to fight. War was the great devourer of the Middle Ages, and for orphans, it opened yet another door into suffering. While families feared the loss of sons and fathers to the battlefield, orphans had no one to shield them from the draft, no advocates to protest, no homes to hide them. Lords, kings, and even mercenary captains saw them as the perfect recruits, disposable, desperate, and unanchored by blood ties. To be an orphan in times of conflict meant being swept into the violent machinery of war long before their bodies or minds were ready to bear its weight. Some orphans were taken in as squires, a position that sounded noble, but was anything but for those without lineage. A squire to a knight might carry weapons, clean armor, care for horses, and run errands across muddy camps. These tasks demanded relentless labor, and any mistake could draw harsh blows from the knight's gauntleted hand. The promise was that, in time, a squire might rise to knighthood. But for orphans, this was a hollow illusion. Nobles reserved the honor of knighthood for those of blood and family, while nameless children remained servants forever. They carried swords they would never wield for themselves, polished shields that would never bear their crest, and tended to horses that symbolized wealth they would never know. Others were pressed into armies as little more than expendable helpers. Young boys trailed behind soldiers, carrying supplies, fetching water, or scavenging for firewood. Girls were pulled into camps to cook, wash, or serve in far darker roles. These children were not fighters by choice, yet battlefields consumed them all the same. When armies marched, they were forced to follow. When armies starved, they starved first. When armies lost, they were often slaughtered alongside the defeated. Orphans became invisible casualties of war, their deaths unrecorded, their bodies buried in shallow graves or left to rot where they fell. The brutality of the battlefield stripped away what little innocence remained. Orphans witnessed sights that scarred them permanently. Comrades hacked down in front of them, fields littered with corpses, rivers turned red with blood. Some were forced to loot bodies, pulling off boots or armor from the dead, learning to see human remains as mere resources. Others scavenged for food among the slain, desperate enough to eat whatever could be found in the chaos of war. The line between survival and horror blurred until there was no difference. Childhood vanished completely in the shadow of slaughter, replaced by a hardened numbness that kept them alive, at least for a while. What made war particularly cruel for orphans was how it exploited their lack of choice. Families sometimes bribed officials or hid their sons when levies came, but orphans had no one to shield them. Their vulnerability made them easy prey for recruiters who promised food, adventure, or coin, only to deliver them into blood-soaked fields. Once enlisted, they were bound by oaths they could barely understand, expected to obey or die. Refusal was punished with execution, desertion with mutilation. For children already marked by society as expendable, the battlefield was simply the final confirmation of that judgment. There are accounts of child messengers who carried notes through enemy lines, often running barefoot across terrain littered with traps and soldiers. Many never returned, caught and executed as spies. Others were handed weapons too heavy for their arms, pushed to the front as fodder against enemy charges. The few who survived these encounters often carried lifelong injuries, shattered bones, missing limbs, or blindness caused by arrows or boiling oil. War made them not only orphans of parents, but orphans of themselves, stripped of bodies and futures alike. And yet, within the savagery, war sometimes offered a grim form of belonging. Among soldiers, orphans could blend into a makeshift brotherhood, sharing rations, laughter, and despair around fires. For boys who had grown up excluded from every circle of society, this camaraderie felt like family, even if it was temporary. But this bond was fragile, shattered whenever a campaign ended, when comrades were slain, or when the army disbanded. What remained was the same loneliness they had always carried, now deepened by grief. The aftermath of war was just as destructive. Orphans who survived battles often returned to towns with nothing but trauma. Some drifted into mercenary bands, trading their youth for coin in endless cycles of bloodshed. Others became beggars once again, their bodies too broken to fight, but their reputations too stained for honest work. Many were haunted by visions of the dead, nightmares that stole their sleep and left them wandering in silence. In a world that had already rejected them, war carved the final scar, ensuring that even survival came at the cost of peace. The paradox is striking. Society distrusted orphans, feared them, and marginalized them. Yet in times of war, it consumed them eagerly. They were unwanted in peace, but essential in conflict, a contradiction that exposed the hypocrisy of the medieval order. Kings who ignored their suffering in times of harvest suddenly claimed them in times of battle. Lords who called them thieves one day dressed them in armor the next, sending them to die for causes they could never inherit. Their expendability became their only value, their blood the coin of wars they never chose. And so, war was not an escape from the misery of orphanhood. It was its extension. It magnified their pain, exploited their desperation, and confirmed their disposability. Yet even here, in the mud of battlefields, in the cries of dying men, and in the flames of burning villages, orphans clung to the faintest will to survive. Because beyond war lay yet another enemy waiting, one that was quieter, but no less deadly: the slow erosion of spirit caused by daily violence, exploitation, and abandonment. And that battle, fought in silence after the wars ended, was often the hardest to endure. The life of an orphan in the Middle Ages was already defined by hunger, rejection, and exploitation, but nothing shaped them more profoundly than the constant presence of violence. Violence was not simply an event in their lives, it was a daily environment, a rhythm that followed them from the marketplace to the alley, from the noble's kitchen to the battlefield. For children who had lost their families, every corner of medieval society became a potential trap, every adult a possible threat, every day another test of survival in a world that did not hesitate to strike down the defenseless. Street violence was often their first teacher. Without parents to protect them, orphans were targets not only for guards and townsfolk, but for other beggars and older children competing for the same scraps of food. A small boy carrying a stolen loaf of bread might be ambushed by a group of older vagrants, beaten until his ribs cracked and left with nothing. Fights over resting spots in barns or graveyards ended with bruises, broken noses, and even death. These skirmishes were not petty quarrels, but battles for survival, each one reinforcing the lesson that the weak were consumed by the strong. This brutal education carved fear into their bones, but it also forced them to grow cunning, quick, and distrustful, traits that would shape the rest of their short lives. Beyond the streets, orphans who found themselves serving in noble households discovered that violence was a constant tool of discipline. Mistakes were met with slaps, whippings, or worse. Some lords took pride in cruelty, striking children in front of guests as a display of authority. Others devised humiliations more subtle but no less painful, forcing a child to kneel on stone floors until their knees bled, or making them hold heavy buckets of water for hours until their arms gave out. These punishments were justified as lessons in obedience, yet they broke more spirits than they corrected. For orphans, the absence of family meant no one stood between them and the master's hand. The blows fell harder because no voice ever rose in their defense. For girls, violence often carried a darker and unspoken edge. Sexual abuse was a shadow that followed them wherever they served. In taverns, castles, and even monasteries, their vulnerability was exploited by men who knew there would be no consequence for their actions. A girl might be summoned to a chamber under the pretense of service, only to find herself trapped in situations from which she could not escape. These acts were rarely spoken of openly, but they left invisible scars that shaped lives just as profoundly as hunger or cold. Fear became their shield, silence their survival strategy, yet the price was an adulthood marked by trauma that society refused to acknowledge. The brutality of guards and soldiers added another layer of danger. Authorities were quick to punish orphans who stole, begged, or even loitered in the wrong place. Whippings in the marketplace, public humiliations in the stocks, or forced labor in dungeons were all common punishments for crimes that were often nothing more than acts of survival. The law was not a shield, but a weapon turned against them, designed to keep order by making examples of the weakest. To live as an orphan meant living under the constant threat of legal violence, knowing that the same town that ignored your suffering would eagerly punish your desperation. Even within institutions meant to protect them, violence lurked. Orphanages and monasteries were filled with harsh discipline, where caretakers believed that pain was necessary to shape obedience. Rods, whips, and cold cells were tools of correction, applied not sparingly but as part of daily life. A child who spoke out of turn, who failed to memorize a prayer, or who resisted chores could expect bruises as part of their education. In Calais, some children grew numb to this, accepting beatings as routine, while others carried the trauma into adulthood, their spirits broken before they could even dream of freedom. Violence became the language through which authority spoke, and orphans learned to understand it fluently. But violence was not always inflicted by others. Sometimes it was born from within. Years of suffering turned some orphans into aggressors themselves. Beaten, exploited, and rejected, they sometimes redirected their pain onto others weaker than them. A boy who had been whipped might later strike a younger child who annoyed him. A girl who had been humiliated might torment someone smaller in order to reclaim a fragment of power. This cycle of abuse replicated itself endlessly, proving how violence not only destroyed bodies, but also reshaped identities. In a society that gave them no tools of compassion, brutality became the only inheritance they could pass on. Perhaps the most haunting element of this constant violence was its normalization. To medieval society, the beatings, whippings, and abuse of orphans were not scandals. They were expected, accepted, even encouraged. A child without parents was assumed to require harsher discipline, to be naturally inclined towards sin and rebellion. Pain was seen as the only way to mold them into obedience. This cultural acceptance meant that violence against orphans rarely caused outrage, and when deaths occurred, they were dismissed as unfortunate but inevitable. The silence of society became its own form of cruelty, reinforcing the idea that these children's lives were worth less than others. And yet, amidst this relentless tide of brutality, orphans displayed a resilience that defied expectation. Some learned to use their small size and agility to escape punishments, darting through alleys or slipping out of reach just in time. Others formed protective groups, defending one another against beatings or finding comfort in the solidarity of shared suffering. In rare cases, orphans even managed to rise above their oppression, turning their intimate knowledge of violence into survival skills that allowed them to carve out fragile independence. These flickers of resistance were fragile, but they proved that even in the harshest conditions, the will to endure was stronger than the forces that tried to extinguish it. Violence was the thread woven through every stage of an orphan's life, binding their experiences into a fabric of suffering. It broke bones, silenced voices, and scarred spirits, but it also taught them hard lessons about power, obedience, and survival. And while most could not escape its grip, their endurance in the face of it reveals both the cruelty of the world that shaped them and the resilience of the children who bore its weight. Yet even those who survived the daily brutality knew that violence was not their only enemy. Beyond beatings and punishments lay an even more devastating reality, a destiny of invisibility, where their lives and deaths passed without memory, unrecorded in the chronicles of history. The final fate of orphans in the Middle Ages was often sealed not by a single act of cruelty, but by the quiet weight of inevitability. From the moment they were abandoned or left parentless, their lives were marked by a sense of doom, as though the world itself had written their story before they could even speak their names. For most, the destination was early death, and for those who lived longer, it was a lifetime of invisibility, servitude, or despair. This inevitability was the cruelest aspect of their existence. Not only were they crushed by hunger, disease, and violence, but they were also denied the chance to dream of anything beyond survival. Death came early, and it came often. The fragile bodies of children who grew up malnourished could not withstand the relentless cycle of winters, plagues, and endless labor. Few orphans lived past their teens. Those who reached their 20s were seen as exceptions, almost as though they had cheated fate. The mortality rates for abandoned children were staggering, with some towns recording survival rates so low that nearly every child left at an orphanage or parish house was dead within a year. Imagine walking through a medieval cemetery where row upon row of unmarked graves hid the stories of children who never had the chance to carve their own place in history. Their short lives were erased as efficiently as their names, leaving behind only silence. But even survival carried no promise of redemption. Those who managed to endure into adulthood often found themselves trapped in endless cycles of labor and poverty. A boy who had once stolen bread to survive might grow into a man laboring in fields he could never own. A girl who had scrubbed floors in a convent as a child might remain a servant until her final breath, her body bent and broken from decades of toil. These were not stories of triumph, but of quiet defeat. Where living longer only meant enduring suffering for more years, their futures were rarely their own, dictated instead by the chains of class and the indifference of a society that refused to see them as equal. What made their fate especially cruel was the lack of legacy. Medieval society placed immense value on lineage and family, yet orphans had none to carry their memory forward. There were no family names to protect them, no kin to speak of their deeds, no descendants to honor them after death. A nobleman might live on through chronicles and monuments, a merchant through his wealth and trade, but an orphan disappeared the moment they stopped breathing. Their existence was swallowed whole by time, their contributions, however small, dissolving into the void of forgetfulness. This erasure was perhaps more painful than death itself, for it meant that even endurance did not guarantee remembrance. And yet, within this inevitability, there were rare sparks of defiance. Some orphans carved out identities in ways that defied the system. A handful became soldiers who earned recognition for their bravery, monks whose manuscripts survived, or healers whose names lingered in village tales. These stories are scattered like stars in a dark sky, so rare that they shine all the brighter. They prove that not every orphan vanished into silence, but their rarity also reinforces the overwhelming truth. Most were never allowed the chance to escape anonymity. The exceptions did not break the pattern. They only highlighted how unbreakable it was. The psychological toll of knowing this fate was immense. Orphans grew up watching their peers die, their companions vanish, their dreams collapse under the weight of reality. Hope was dangerous, because it made disappointment sharper when it inevitably came. Many learned to suppress their desires, teaching themselves that wanting more was a path to pain. This resignation shaped their very identities, turning them into people who survived not by striving for better, but by enduring the worst. And in a way, this surrender became another form of death, a quiet extinguishing of spirit long before the body failed. The absence of upward mobility also ensured that cycles of orphanhood repeated across generations. Some who grew into adulthood did have children, but without wealth or protection, those children were often left vulnerable to the same fate. War, plague, or famine could strip away a fragile family in an instant, returning yet another generation to the streets. In this way, orphanhood was not just an individual tragedy, but a recurring curse that haunted the poorest layers of medieval society. It was a cycle that no single act of endurance could break, because the entire structure of the world was built to maintain it. Yet the inevitability of their fate does not mean their lives lacked meaning. Even in their suffering, orphans shaped the medieval world in ways often overlooked. Their labor sustained markets, their presence filled monasteries, their service supported nobles, and their sacrifices fueled wars. They were invisible architects of the very society that erased them. Without them, the machinery of the medieval world would have faltered, and yet they remained nameless, their contributions forgotten even as they were essential. This paradox makes their story not only tragic, but deeply revealing of the society that used them so completely. What remains most haunting is how silence enveloped their end. No chronicles dedicated chapters to their suffering. No poets sang their grief. No stained glass windows depicted their lives. And yet, behind every shining cathedral, every thriving market, every victorious battle, lay the hands and blood of orphans who were never remembered. Their fate was to vanish, and in that vanishing, they remind us of the countless forgotten voices that history has buried. To recall their story now is to rebel against that silence, to give names back to the nameless, even if only in memory. And so, the final fate of the medieval orphan was not just death, but erasure. Their struggle was not simply to survive hunger or beatings, but to survive being forgotten by the world around them. They lived in shadows, died in silence, and disappeared without echo. And while a few rare souls defied this destiny, the overwhelming truth remains. For the medieval orphan, life was not a path of opportunity, but a narrowing tunnel, leading almost inevitably to an end that came too soon, with no one left to remember that they had ever been there at all.